Good afternoon from Lindome outside Gothenburg, and we are here today this 1st of November afternoon, having a start of a lecture. And today I was thinking of speaking about Bohm and how he watched and saw viewpoint and direction. Those are very important things that we have mentioned briefly a long time ago, but directions are a very important part in classical physics. It's also called trajectory, and it's about the future goal of something. If you have a particle of some sort, it is going somewhere, going from the start to its goal, endpoint. And this distance is called trajectory, and the direction, the angle, an angle that is in reference to the universe. But in Newton, as we all know, it's in reference to an absolute point of reference. And that is called inert point of reference. But there are some problems with that, and I would not take up that today though. I will just skip the criticism and see what we have today. We are living in the post-Newtonian world, and that means that our sense of direction is hugely influenced by Newton. And one oddity about Newton is that if you have arrows going in opposing directions, they are equaling themselves out. So you end up with this. It's a sign called nil. It's nothing. It's less than nothing. It's zero, zero and zero. Or there is another trait with the Newtonian sense of directionality, and it is that we have so many directions, so they seem to dissipate energy. We don't have the one direction, we have many and many and many. And in this directionality, everything disappears or seems to disappear. But what happens in the blur of all the different directions, all the trajectories, it's impossible to see a unifying principle. And it's this unifying principle I want to point to today. In quantum physics, it's called the undivided wholeness. Undivided wholeness. And that could also be perceived as the hollow movement or the hollow flux. David Bohm preferred hollow flux, but it's maybe a little bit more inconvenient. But it is a fundamental sense of motion that is much more fundamental than the Newtonian trajectories that we are handling on an everyday basis. It's a primordial movement. And this hollow movement or hollow flux is the cause of both things in this world that are permanent and things that are not permanent. Things that are at the standstill and things that are, in our perspective, our relative perspective, moving about. Now here comes the first difference that can help you to understand the hollow movement. Hollow movement is a movement that doesn't take reference. It doesn't have something you measure it against. It's an absolute movement. And of course that is very hard to perceive, but you can count on it mathematically. And what Bohm wanted to do is to transfer this to us ordinary human beings without this sensational mathematical knowledge that is actually needed. And I usually refer to this Newtonian directionality as level 1, and that is to simplify explanations. And what is due on level 1 sort of works on level 1 as well, but level 1 and level 2 for that matter are dependent on the focal setting, how we choose to view things. And the viewpoint in classical physics is being that of like the Heideggerian phrase "vorhanden," something that we take out of its context. We do not look at wholeness. We look at something discrete, definite, something defined. That's one way of going about things. That's one focal setting. So you sort of fix your gaze or your experience or your whole being towards that. And if you do that, this is what you're going to perceive, more or less. But if you open up the focal setting and you encompass more also what's around you, and I mean this is in a most literal sense, because we have today, you might put a panorama here, a most beautiful autumn sky this 1st of November. So we get space here. And we know that we are shutting space out of our lives because we are always using this focal setting of discreteness. And we tend to see ourselves as very clearly defined discrete entities. And by doing that, both in the mental sphere and the body sphere, we shut everything else out. We make borders, frontiers. And in the bodily perspective, that border is mid my body. So what's behind this line, this vertical line, it's not in existence. And I thought it was a funny thing when I had my drawing classes. I often noticed that people didn't draw that part of the body. And if they draw it much smaller than it was. And I think that goes to show it's not there. It's not perceived. It's blocked out somehow. So this way of perceiving, it comes at a price. And that goes hand in hand with the metaphor of the focal setting. Of course, if you put the microscope or the binocular very, very sharp to a single little point, you will block everything outside that zoom point out. It won't be there. So what happens? Well, for every time we do this focal setting and sharpen things up, we get a new object and we get a new direction. And every time we do that, we get different directionality, going in all different angles. And this goes for the lack of energy, because of the all trajectories, directions, we lose energy. Average trajectory takes its energy. Once again, the same with the body. We need a singular, unified direction, upwards. We know even from the primitive animals like an amoeba, going upwards to the turtles and further, all these animals show a single unified direction. It doesn't go all over the place. But when it comes to human beings, we direct our energy in all sorts of ways. And it's completely by happenstance. It's not controlled. And we're going to perceive this as blurriness. If you over sharpen the focus in the camera, in the binocular or the microscope, you will get the blurriness when you point it towards the whole world. So we tend to make all different lookings into the camera or the binoculars into one object or one instance. And we think by adding all these instances, we get more of reality. And this is, of course, reductionist put in very much simpler words, not so philosophical, but something that our body can understand. It's getting fainter too. This perception is much fainter. It is not as vivid. And I think that's funny, because most people today, they lack this vividness, this joyfulness in perception. It's sort of grayish. It's this sameish feeling of everything being the same. It's a blasé gaze. You look blasé, bored. In the end, this can almost turn into a haze. But let's change the focal setting a bit. Let's take in the surrounding space that we have completely free, and we look from another perspective, more encompassing, more comprehensive. And all of a sudden, all these different objects sort of conglomerate into one object. One unified field of observance. Everything seems to fit together in a better way. It becomes more coherent. And no longer do we have this problem that the directions are equaling each out. They disappear, they dissipate, they become nil. Instead, we have this chaos phenomena, where all the different directions, all the irregularity that we often perceived on level 1, it's actually the supporting substance. This is what makes chaotic order so much stronger, incredibly strong. And for every time we add more muddled directionality, it becomes even stronger. You can only look at a maelstrom coming to being in a river, and you'll see the more water coming in all sorts of direction, the clearer the maelstrom will become. It becomes long-lasting, definite, and with a very clear direction. It is going to start to behave almost conscious, going in different directions, making choices. And this mere encompassing focal setting goes for both what we could call bodily sphere or bodily level and a more mental level. We talked before about law of the excluded middle. That's a way of shutting space out in the mental sphere. We say a little area is the important area, the other ones should go, should be blocked out. We make in our mental sphere clear divisions. And as well as in the bodily sphere, in the mental sphere, we get this muddiness. We get all these borders, and in the end that could be almost like the balloon head, when many thoughts are competing for the little space there is. And for every time we do new definitions, more polarizations, and using, for instance, the law of the excluded middle, and seeing contradictions, we will further divide everything into subject and object, into true, into false, into up, into down. So maybe you can see here how there is actually sort of a similarity between directions and polarity, and with this subject-object division. And we have a direction in this that could be eased up as well. This is on level 1, and it's the idea that everything is coming directed from the subject to what you're perceiving. It's going in this direction, not the other way around. Something, of course, being questioned in quantum physics, because in quantum physics it goes in both directions at the same time. Can you now see the wholeness, how it's working? That on another level, on level 2, everything is connected in another way. It's not sharp divisions. You're not shut out of the world. And what happens when we do this in the mental sphere too much? We become tired. We start losing energy. Our thinking process is not as strong anymore. Everything gets diluted. And this strong, strange attractor, to use an expression from chaos theory, that we had from the beginning, is getting weaker and weaker, because we do not change focal setting. We stay in this very specific mode, and it's almost like we can't change that mode. It becomes habituated. And going over to the body once more, when you reunite the directions in the body, for instance in the Alexander method, we say let the neck be free so the head can go upwards and forwards, and the back can lengthen and widen. There seem to be different directions, but when we do it sequentially and simultaneously, which you actually can, you will start feeling there is a unifying direction in the body as well. And all of a sudden you become a little more present. You're not as hazy, as dim, as blurred as before. Your body is becoming more defined. And oddly enough, it becomes more precise, because precision is something we need in the body as well. Some areas should be more relaxed, and others should have some tension to them. But in this blurry level 1 multidirectionality, that became lost. One thing that especially pointed out by John Appleton is the seam that goes in between the ventral and the dorsal surfaces. And this seam that goes here needs to be very specifically defined, because it's an helping agent. It's the actual point of complementarity. The two areas need to be precisely defined, and that will in the end help the unified direction. And you will feel this directionality in your body. And in some cultures they call it ki or chi. In Indian tradition it's called prana, and when it's as it's very strongest it's called the kundalini. That's the force coming from the spine going upwards and giving directionality to all other parts, but not dissipating anything. The more you have one unified direction, the more you can give to the singular events you do, the singular movements. That will actually define your hand movements, your foot movements, your way of walking, yeah, even running, and such a thing as talking that I'm doing right now. It becomes very different. And although it can be very hard to think it's possible to change your focal setting, it might even seem like a game of words to say, take in the environment. Those ideas could make it harder to reach that area. You need to firmly understand and believe in yourself that's possible. And that's one of the reasons quantum physics is so important, because it's what kicks the whole engine to start it to going in this direction. When you understand there is an undivided wholeness underneath everything, and all the small energies you're feeling, all the small directions and divisions are coming from that. It's almost like a fountain, and it's a never-ending fountain as well, because remember that this directionality that we find in the holy movement, it's not defined in reference to anything else, to a specific point. And I think that's part of the problem in our thinking, is this narrowing of the logic, because we need to talk about the logic as well. And the idea that everything has to originate somewhere, it's making the whole thing impossible in some way. And this is exactly the same that Newton had problems with. He wanted that to be a middle point in the universe, and he wanted it to be a generalized perception of time as well, a clock existing somewhere in the middle of the universe, giving equal time to the whole thing at once, because that was necessary from his paper exercises. But mind you, that is not reality. That's in truth a complete illusion. And this is an illusion that will lead you astray to areas where you don't want to go. It will make you unconsciously believing that there is no way of controlling anything, that you don't have a grip on things. And sure enough, only the belief in that will help the dissipation, will do it more blurred. And it's a little bit like not taking the steering wheel in the car or something similar, or not being in charge of your own life, being forced to give away stuff that you should do yourself to help the directionality. And isn't that the modern world in a nutshell? Everything is delegated today. How you get your food, how you cook it, how you live, you're taking care of the household, the electricity and so forth. These are things that could help to lure you into the idea that you have no control whatsoever. It doesn't have to go that way, but it makes it much easier to go into the slippery slopey way downwards. And when I think about that, I think directly of the downward pull, because this modern phenomenon, more or less, I don't see that in Renaissance painting. Well, to be honest, I have seen it once or twice, but it's extremely uncommon. But that's a sure proof that the energy is not going in one direction. You have loads of arrows going in a way that are completely happenstance, doesn't have a true directionality. And this is also, oddly enough, very similar to what Betty Edwards taught as a drawing teacher. How we try to take away the negative space in everything, and only do like Parmenides, try to figure out the object, the important stuff. All the other is unimportant. Here you see this division going on a very, very practical level. And it takes away the clearness, the vividness of reality. And you can see that when you draw that way, because all the objects becomes very, very dense, impenetrable. You can't get through them. Like huge building blocks, making barriers, making it impossible to loosen things up. Finding more space, finding more areas to go. This is almost like fractal theory, where on every level you see the same thing on the next level. Because this is exactly what happens in the mental level. We tend to think about our knowledge object like the positive space. Like Betty Edwards said, the objects or what you want to draw. And you have all your knowledge in the head like separated with divisions in between, and you focus on what you know, and the rest which is surrounding the knowledge bits is unknowledge, lack of knowledge, ignorance. And this is making a forceful division that's not true to reality, because oddly enough, a lot of knowledge can actually come from ignorance. It's a dividing line which helps us to understand what we actually know. And it's in itself not completely empty space, something we should rid us of, because it's also part of reality. Even unknowledge is part of reality. You can hear here, I'm not a representationalist. I don't believe in things being somewhere else in an outer world, outside our own perception. Everything is inside this experience. And that means that even unknowledge has a say, something that could be important. And by excluding unknowledge, what surrounds your knowledge, you're making heavy fortifications, borders. And say, I have that knowledge piece, and I have that knowledge piece, and I have that knowledge piece. It's going to be very hard to have a wholeness there, and to make new understanding, and to remold, to make something new from the details, because they are so firmly separated, they can't go into each other. Why most of the inventions that has been made in science is just about letting the borders loose, back off a bit, and by backing off you see the whole picture better, and you find something completely new. Because if we define knowledge too hard, it's very, very tough to go further and find something new from that. They become like building blocks, almost like slates you build a wall with. Put them on top of each other. I think Edward de Bono called that stone logic. And the idea is that you gather as many stones as possible and you pile them up on top of each other to have a whole picture. And of course, that's a very cumbersome way of going about it. It takes a lot of energy. And in the end, your whole head is filled with these building blocks. And just the belief in that those are actual building blocks, defined hardly, often with a body that's tensed because you try to hold them like they are. They will make thinking very, very hard. I liked it so much when Edward de Bono came with a book called Water Logic, where he said that we should look at knowledge as water, something you can fill up, and it's not excluding, because if you fill up more water you get a volume that's bigger. That's not happening with the stone logic. They seem to go in opposite directions somehow. And water is flexible. It can be molded, transformed. It could be ice, it could be steam. Its fluidity, that metaphor, that picture is so much better than the stone logic. And you don't risk into coming into this terrible trap, I would say, like the excluded middle is. The inventor or the creator of paraconsistent logic, Graham Priest, said that there is an elusiveness to law of the excluded middle. It has a lure, but once you're caught, it can be very hard to get out. You get used to it, and you get stubborn. Like they say in the Bible, Kalle, hard-necked. And this is meant in a very literal sense. You are going to tense your neck, because that's the attitude of the stone logic. And it's interesting to see that there are so many strings coming from different areas that leads to the same point. I guess you can see now that the directionality, that the directions equals out and we stand there with nothing. It's caused by that logic. But it's not true to reality, because it takes time to even fathom a trajectory. And you do it in a certain order. It doesn't exist directly all at once. You make one arrow at a time. And it's not unimportant in which order you do that. It's something I will get back to later this week, because it's also very important. We forget those things. It's a sort of amnesia that makes us unknowingly, or I wouldn't say ignorant, but there is a sense of not being able to see clear. All the objects seem to take up some space, both in the head and in the body. And you have this doubling sense in the body. I can feel it sometimes too. So both you have the movement, and then you have the perception of the arm. And that makes the arm feels very, very mechanical, like an extra device. That is not only the pure directionality, it's something extra, hanging loose like this, not connected, not going in the same direction. And it's this lower focal setting, this lower logic, that makes us think that even though we are looking one way, turning another way, and going a third way, it could still the same be one and the same direction. And this is a very important point when it comes to the focal setting. In the lower focal setting, that's not allowed. That's a paradox there. It's like Plato or Aristotle, I should say, not Plato, but Aristotle would say, that's unlawful, we shouldn't do that. But I think those notions should and could be challenged. And you will notice that just by looking at these things in a more softened way, you will get more energy and you feel more opportunities. And I think this is very greatly connected to creativity. Something that De Boon often mentions, that stone logic is the enemy of creativity. Because according to stone logic, everything is already defined. Everything is out there somehow. And it's just for you to perceive it, but it can't be altered, fixed, hard, definitely hard. And Bohm, he takes this even further, this is like an extra thing I just want to add here at the end of the lecture, but he takes it to spiritual level. He says that when you start softening the different borders, one good example is future, past and present, which we usually cut off very clearly. And this cutting off is very clearly a parallel to the cutting off of space, because we halve ourselves in the vertical line. But if we think of time like moving, this is just a metaphor, everything that's past me, that's gone, doesn't exist anymore. We make a clear cut. And I think that's one of the reasons that we don't understand that such good things like meaning and knowledge actually come from the past in some way. We discussed that briefly, me and Kalle, that etymology is very important, and it has to do with the meaning of words, the use of the words, the language game. It has its place both in the past and in the now, not only in the now. It has been formed somehow. Yes, it's being reused now. It's getting widened and looked in a different perspective. But we also need the material from the past to having that energy from where it was made. Otherwise, we block that knowledge out by having too sharply defined what is now the only existing thing. And then the past becomes nonsensical, empty, blocked out, negative space. But here we can talk about negative time. And as we have a three-partitive division with time in contrast to space, we also have future. And the future is obscure, also something we can't know, because it's and this is very odd here. According to level 1, often in level 1, it's classical physics that rules. And classical physics says the future is determined. But it also says we can't know anything about the future, because all the factors, all the directions, all the arrows, all the knowledge objects, they're just too many. And people do like this. We can't know anything about the future. It's somehow determined, but we can't know, we can't control it. And I think that's also caused by this division. Because we say, here, in front of me, just in the next second, the future starts. But I'm just here and not in the next second. Can you see how the divisions causes blindness, or you shutting out things from experience. And then if we start to think about that, we don't have to have that double negative from classical physics that says it's determined, it's nothing you can do, and at the same time saying, well, you can't know about it either because there's too many factors. There's a gazillion factors. Maybe the worst that I should do in some part of the educational systems to the poor students, to tell them that you should read as much as you can in school and gather so many knowledge bits as you can possibly can. And these stone bits you have to gather to make some sort of incredibly crude planning of the future or foreseeing of the future. I think that's a completely hopeless project. There's just too many pieces and you don't even know how to gather them. And I think that is what is modern day stress, because we feel so worried about the future. The reason being we can't control it. And in the end you get locked somehow. Because of the stress, you give your future up. Maybe you go somewhere to a deserted island and you live your life there and say, I can't handle the future anymore. I have to isolate myself because it's too stressful. Or as somebody else said a couple of weeks ago, I can only be relaxed when I'm not thinking about planning or doing anything. And that's pretty awful. It could actually be when we are most relaxed, we will be most perceptive to the future. When we're in a good mood, on vacation or something like that. And we could instead see that we can actually have some control of the future when we don't shut it out. When we don't say it's distant. When we don't say it's the other end of the polarity. Very far away. And in this you still have a unifying movement. You can have your future, you can have your past, you can have your no. And just when, like in the picture of the different directions, even though the directions are going different ways, there is an underlying primordial unified field. That's the implicit knowledge, and this is what Bohm hints to. And that movement goes in one direction, but that direction is what's causing all the other small directions that seem to be so chaotic. This is exactly the same as in chaos theory. You have one unifying direction that takes its energy from all the other ones, even though they are going in different directions. And this knowledge is something that's not allowed on level 1, with the law of the excluded middle and a very fixed focal setting. And you can say when you go to level 2 you get a more open setting, a more encompassing setting. And this is very similar to like taking in the surrounding space, taking in the future and the past. You can do that in the same way. Open up for it. And you can see that these divisions that were so firm, they seem to loosen up. So I lost my concentration with just a bat flying out there. I so seldom see those. We're getting dusk here, and it was a lovely moment, caught in time, a bat flying out. You very seldom see that. And this goes to show for the awesomeness of reality. It's not all fixed. Everything is not determined. There is a complete cornucopia of amazing things in the world. What is that we just change our focal setting. We make it broader, more encompassing. And all of a sudden, all the colors, all the vividness, all the flavors, all of the energies are coming back. And at the same time, you gain more energy, you get more direction. And this is what Bohm is referring to, the spiritual path of his Bohemian vision. And is that when you understand the unified field, you will see that there is a directionality that never ends, that is not limited to a sphere of existing things, where the outside is blocked out. Instead, rather, it's a constantly expanding reality, both when it comes to time, space, but also the knowledge parts. You can gain more and more knowledge, and in that you gain an increasing level of richness, and this richness will in its turn enliven, energize space and time. And this is the movement between implicit and explicit. This is what creates the hollow movement. Observing, having an observance, and then going back to the implicit again. It's a constant, interesting, energizing movement. And it's getting a bit darker. I think this is a good time to round up all things. But I say thank you very much. It was a pleasant having you today, and have a very, very good night.
Thank you.